Greetings. Thanks everyone for taking the time out of this nice spring season to come to this final lecture of the academic year. And thanks to Jennifer Coggins and the Beinecke Library for all the organizational work to have this event. And I'm just going to give a few anecdotes related to my current research project. And so let's go. In May 1948, B.G. Nsaya, a young Ashanti school teacher and resident of the Gold Coast colony, now Ghana in West Africa, wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois requesting some research materials. Writing just months after the ex-servicemen riots in Accra, less than a month after Kwame Nkrumah's release from jail, and right at the moment of the Convention People's Party's formation, Nsaya presently noted that, quote, a new social order is struggling grimly to be born, end quote. An elite-led movement for gradual transition to self-governance had suddenly transformed into a mass movement for immediate decolonization. With the new post-colonial social order on the way, Nsaya told Du Bois that he desired to do, quote, research on colonial problems. Curiously, Nsaya requested Du Bois procure for him just two books, Black Reconstruction and The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. Douglass's third and final autobiography, The Life and Times, was hard to come by. The only edition in circulation at that time was a subscription-only limited edition printed by Barbadian Pan-Africanist and anti-imperialist Richard B. Moore. Few even in the U.S. knew about the edition, but there were advertisements for it in the journal The African Interpreter, which circulated in West Africa and was edited by African students in the U.S., all of a militant anti-colonial bent. Nsaya desired to use Douglass's abolitionist thought to reflect upon colonial problems. And I want to suggest that his desire to read Douglass in order to understand the colonial situation stemmed from an older Pan-African intellectual tradition going back to the mid-19th century. This talk will explore how African, Caribbean, and some African American intellectuals reinterpreted Douglass's life and thought, transforming the abolitionist into an icon of early Pan-Africanism. Douglass was perhaps the most widely known Black thinker on race questions during an era that began hopefully with emancipation, anti-Confederation, but culminated tragically in Reconstruction and wholesale colonization of Africa. As such, from the beginning of his public life to the decades following his death in 1895, Douglass's ideas circulated and far more widely and were mobilized in many more contexts than scholars have presumed. These varied but connected strands of commemoration, invocation, and radical reinterpretation eventually converged in the seminal Pan-African Conference of 1900 and later in Garveyism, both of which appropriated Douglass as one of their principal icons. Scholars have entirely ignored Douglass's curious relationship to Pan-Africanism for a number of reasons. For one, the rich scholarship on Douglass's transatlantic activism focuses on his sojourns to the British Isles and to a lesser extent Haiti, neglecting that Douglass's influence, even during his own lifetime, extended far beyond the places he personally visited. Moreover, given that abolitionism served as the ideological pretext for the partition and colonization of Africa, scholars have often neglected to account for abolitionist influences upon Pan-Africanism, a movement which eventually challenged the colonial projects that so often touted their abolitionist roots. Finally, scholars of Pan-Africanism, following a venerable tradition, going back to George Padmore, Africanism is emerging out of 19th century Black nationalist tendencies that advocated African American immigration to West Africa. Because he opposed such movements his whole career, Douglass is sometimes presumed to have no place within the genealogy of Pan-Africanism. As Douglass scholar Walter Martin articulated the position, quote, for Pan-Africanists, Douglass's integrationism, Americanism, and opposition to African immigration have made him a target for criticism. It has been exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to exploit him, end quote. But as I'll suggest here, it was precisely those for whom Douglass was purportedly impossible to exploit, who reimagined him most prolifically. Reimaginings of Douglass began circulating in an era of counter-revolution. In the Pan-African context, this was a triple counter-revolution: the 1865 suppression of the Morant Bay Revolt in Jamaica, the overthrow of Reconstruction in 1876, and the British overthrow of the independent Fanti Confederation in 1874. The Berlin Conference came just 10 years later. This was also the era of British-Boer infighting and conflict in South Africa, later culminating in a reconciliation between Brit and Boer, which some reconciliation between North and South that had destroyed Reconstruction. There were varied responses to the dawn of Jim Crow and colonialism, from collaboration and compromise to national awakening in Africa and increased Afro-American interest in immigration to West Africa. But many intellectuals looked upon the era of reconstructions with nostalgia. For example, in 1928, the Gold Coast nationalist J. de Graaf Johnson, himself a Fante, in his seminal pamphlet Towards Nationhood in West Africa, noted the coincidence that the visionary project of Fante constitutionalism and U.S. abolition democracy had risen and fallen simultaneously. As the most famous Black figure in this era of self-determination hopes, shattered by colonial and Jim Crow realities, Douglass would become a persistent point of reference for those trying to make sense of the enormous transformations taking place in their respective societies. Knowledge of Douglass was encountered in many ways. In the U.S., biographies and excerpted speeches of Douglass appeared in African American history textbooks. Some of these textbooks, written by abolitionists or freed people, included bits of African history, as well as passionate defenses of Liberian national self-determination and Haitian self-determination, thus situating Douglass in a Pan-African context. In Liberia, the West Indian polymath and then professor at Liberia College, Edward Blyden, observed that the nation's libraries were stocked with, quote, the stirring and beautiful rhetoric of Sumner and the burning appeals of Frederick Douglass. Another emigre to Liberia in the 1860s, the abolitionist Alexander Crummell, observed that Douglass's newspaper had kindled amongst Liberians, quote, large and generous emotions for our bruised and wounded brethren everywhere. Following Douglass's own journalistic legacy, independent Black newspapers were beginning to proliferate in such places as Sierra Leone, Lagos, and the Gold Coast. As will be discussed below, newspaper editors published obituaries of Douglass, mentioned him in many situations, and even reprinted some of his important speeches. Knowledge circulated in other ways too. Some simply knew Douglass. Ida Gibbs, later secretary and translator for the Pan-African Congress movement, had known Douglass as a child, having first met him in Chicago while he was representing the Haitian government at the 1893 Columbian Exposition. Haitian diplomat and man of letters Antenor Furman also knew Douglass personally, relied on a rare French translation of Douglass's first autobiography in his own writings. William Henry Hurd, an African-American diplomat to Liberia, even met a young Liberian who styled his hair after the fashion of Douglass. Douglass first became known in West Africa as a defender of Liberian sovereignty, a fact ignored by scholars who often assumed that Douglass was indifferent to Africa and loathed Liberia. Douglass indeed loathed white and state-sponsored emigration, but welcomed the prospect of an independent Black republic in West Africa. Already in the 1850s, just after independence, the West Indian Edward Blyden, who had recently emigrated, began reprinting Douglass's articles on Liberia in the Liberian Herald. In one of these reprinted articles, Douglass made powerfully clear the Pan-African stakes of the Liberia project. Quote, in the success or failure of that experiment, every colored man on the globe has a direct interest and must rejoice in its success or lament in its failure, end quote. Out of such true remarks emerged some Liberian myth-making. After post-Reconstruction visits to the U.S. in which he met Douglass, Blyden publicly claimed Douglass told him that as a slave, he had hopes of emigrating to Liberia. He only fled north after his master had thwarted his first desire of going to Liberia. Another Liberian to the U.S. in 1880 wrote back home of his, quote, lengthy and pleasant discussion on the immigration with Frederick Douglass. Certainly these tales were exaggerations, if not total fabrications, but they have a significance. In the age of counter-revolution and colonization, Liberia, though deeply flawed from its inception, stood as the only independent republic in Africa, constantly beleaguered, constantly under threat of being itself colonized. As a result, while sometimes being conscious, just as Douglass was, of the Liberian settler state's convictions, Pan-Africanists from Blyden down to Kwame Nkrumah to Nnamdi Azikiwe made defense of Liberia one of the pillars of Pan-African anti-colonial politics. Douglass, in spite of his own long-standing positions, became a part of that intellectual tradition at its inception. On the other side of the Atlantic, Douglass figured prominently in Trinidadian intellectual J.J. Thomas's 1889 book Frodacity, often seen as the foundational text of Afro-Caribbean political thought. The book was a thorough critique of British historian James Froude, who had argued that abolition ruined the West Indian economy, made formerly hardworking slaves lazy, free peasants, and brought chaos to British governance there. In arguing that Afro-West Indians still lacked capacity for self-rule, Froude singled out Douglass as a former slave of great achievements, only to argue that he was the rare exception. In Frodacity, one of the great polemics of the Thomas in turn relied upon Douglass to prove that even an uneducated fugitive had, quote, conquered his way into the temple of knowledge and become an orator, a writer, and a lecturer on political and general subjects, end quote. Douglass was not the exception that proved the rule, but the rule itself. Emancipation was always a step forward, and Black West Indians were best suited to manage the affairs of the region. Thomas did not call for full independence, yet this book, as well as his large volume on Creole grammar, would have an influence upon later West Indian Pan-Africanists, such as C.L.R. James. During the moment of West Indian decolonization, much later, James republished Thomas's Frodacity. In his preface, which is a profound meditation on the situation of the West Indian intellectual, James dwelled at length on the debate between Froude and Thomas over the meaning of Douglass. James concluded that Thomas's interpretation of Douglass, quote, is of extreme importance today. Native West African intellectuals also invoked Douglass. Joseph Renner Maxwell, a Western-educated Sierra Leonean who grew up on the Gold Coast and worked as a British magistrate in Gambia, wrote during the 1880s and 90s little-known books about the traumatic consequences of slave trading and then partition, which he argued had underdeveloped West Africa morally, spiritually, and economically, sapping its potential for self-rule. Like J.J. Thomas, Maxwell polemicized against Froude's assertions of Black incapacity for self-rule. Though Maxwell remained very pessimistically resigned to a period of temporary tutelage under supposed colonial modernity, he also argued that eventual emancipation would arise by, quote, being more united on the model of the Fantis, whose patriotism and unity are almost proverbial, end quote. Alongside Fanti-inspired unity, West Africans, Maxwell argued, quote, should learn to reverence their great men. Maxwell made no equivocation about whom he had in mind. The two greatest Negroes of this age are Frederick Douglass and the late General Salmon, the able president of Haiti. Even in West Africa, some of the most prominent Negroes have to a certain degree followed their example, though partially and half-heartedly, end quote. There were other kinds of invocations in West Africa. The Sierra Leone Weekly News, a paper founded by Claudius May, son of a liberated African, and Edward Blyden, who had fled Liberia for Sierra Leone, frequently mentioned Douglass. The paper was known for its occasional oppositional stances to colonial policies and gave voice to educated Sierra Leoneans, some of whom pushed for independent, all-African churches and who had begun, under Blyden's influence, rejecting Western clothing and Christian names. An 1890 issue of the paper reprinted Douglass's lecture on the future of the race, right next to a review of J.J. Thomas's Frodacity. The 2 January 1904 issue reprinted Douglass's essay Toussaint L'Ouverture, an estimate by a fellow African, which was intended to be the introduction to the English translation of French abolitionist Victor Schœlcher's biography of Toussaint L'Ouverture, but was never published. Though the editors made no mention of it, perhaps for fear of censorship, it was surely no coincidence that the essay appeared the day after Haiti's 100th independence anniversary. On the Gold Coast, an eccentric though rather mysterious writer named Kwame Ampia regularly contributed aphorisms to the Gold Coast Nation, the official paper of the Aborigines Rights Protection Society, a Fanti-led group originally formed to protest colonial land expropriation policies. Ampia would quote brief passages from Douglass's writings alongside and witticisms of his own conception. Given that the Gold Coast Nation frequently printed Fanti proverbs alongside English translations, readers no doubt made imaginative links between Douglass's sayings and traditional African philosophical wisdom. Interestingly, the Gold Coast editor, Ato Ohuma, despite reprinting Douglass's speeches, found other African figures more significant at this time. In his influential collection of biographies, Memoirs of West African Celebrities from 1905, Ahuma apologized for not including a chapter of Douglass. As he explained, such figures were already well known, and he had wanted to give more prominence to, quote, unadulterated Aborigines from across West Africa. Thus, instead of Douglass, he wrote biographies of the West Africans Ottobah Cugoano and Olaudek Equiano, both of whom played pioneering roles in the British anti-slave trade agitation. Such transatlantic circulations of Douglass generated new but varied images that often cast the great abolitionist in a proto-nationalistic light. For some, he was a defender of the Liberian immigrant state. For others, he was proof that African peoples had all the capacities for self-government. For some South Africans, especially those influenced by the doctrines of Booker T. Washington, Douglass symbolized a kind of black male achievement, a self-made man who could only rise through hard work as well as exposure to Christianity and Western modernity. Occasionally, he was a philosophical elder with proverbs to memorize. His work to overthrow slavery in the U.S. was praised, but interestingly, never utilized to support colonizer-led efforts to abolish domestic slavery in Africa. There were a few who questioned the image of Douglass as the great defender of Black sovereignty. For example, in 1884, the Paris-based Haitian intellectual Louis-Joseph Danvier, despite placing Douglass alongside Toussaint L'Ouverture as one of the two most important Black political figures, rightly criticized Douglass for favoring U.S. annexation of the Dominican Republic. Perhaps the most common image of Douglass was that of a genius whose potentials were thwarted in white supremacist America. As early as 1854, in his account of his travels in West Africa, African-American minister Daniel Peterson wrote, quote, that if such men as Mr. Frederick Douglass would give their time, attention, and talent to Liberia, they would do more good in 1 year than they can in a whole lifetime in the United States, end quote. In 1885, Edward Blyden, fluent in Arabic, sympathetic towards Islamic revivalism in West Africa, and pessimistic about African prospects in post-Reconstruction America, wrote that, quote, Frederick Douglass, as a Mohammedan, would have been a walis, a saint of the religion, an athlete of the faith. Not in the U.S., a man maligned and marginalized. For most such thinkers, the supposedly thwarted genius of Douglass became a powerful argument for the need to build, in abolitionist Martin Delany's words, an Africa for the African race, where self-rule and self-realization might be possible. Douglass's death in 1895 brought grief in many sectors. Haitian diplomats sent their condolences. Alexander Crummell, former longtime resident of Liberia, delivered a sermon at his D.C. funeral service. A young W.E.B. Du Bois, then under the strong influence of Crummell, delivered his own eulogy at Wilberforce University. The 1895 National Convention of Colored Women, besides hosting speeches by Harriet Tubman, Annie Julia Cooper, Frances Harper, and Rosetta Douglass, commemorated both Douglass and his oft-forgotten wife Anna Murray, who had helped Douglass to escape slavery. Early Black feminist and educator Mary Church Terrell urged D.C. secondary schools to observe an annual Frederick Douglass Day holiday. These women also initiated an effort to preserve Douglass's D.C. estate as a museum and site of national and international pilgrimage. Reportedly, at a later time, Haitian minister to the U.S., Dantes Bellegarde, used the Douglass home to deliver fiery speeches about Douglass and about anti-colonialism, which he otherwise could not give in Washington's imperialist diplomatic circles. Obituaries appeared widely in the American press, as scholars have noted, but they also appeared in the San Fernando Gazette of Trinidad and the Lagos Weekly Record, as well as in La Fraternité, a Paris-based journal edited by Haitian diplomat and Pan-Africanist Benito Sylvain. These obituaries often portrayed Douglass as a Pan-African personality. The obituary in Imvo Zambansundu, the first African-run newspaper in South Africa, proclaimed Douglass was, quote, a man of whom all the African hues, both in America and Africa, had reason to be proud, end quote. The Sierra Leone Weekly News wrote, quote, Mr. Douglass's labors for the race were not confined to the United States alone. In Africa, the West Indies, and the Pacific Isles, his work and example exerted an inspiring influence, end quote. The problem was who to replace such a person. Booker T. Washington took the lead in trying to fill the void, using his political connections, media organs, and school to crown himself the heir of Douglass. Washington was a Pan-Africanist, albeit a reactionary one. He had close ties with the Americo-Liberian elite and was a knighted member of the Order of African Redemption. He also worked with Trinidadian Henry Sylvester Williams to plan the 1900 Pan-African Conference, though he did not attend. In his 1906 ghost-written biography of Douglass, Washington made sure to praise Douglass in high terms, while also suggesting his irrelevance. Douglass's lifetime encompassing the abolitionist era of revolutionary agitation, followed by the Reconstruction era of Black voting, were over. Radical activism and opposition must give way to accommodation and collaboration. Washington's late views of Douglass and of U.S. domestic politics coincided with his shifting views of Africa. Once a rather passionate critic of colonialism, Washington began working with colonial regimes to promote African regeneration through industrial education. The influence of Washington on colonial administrators and some African elites, especially in South Africa, is well known. It only needs to be noted that this reflected in interpretations of Douglass. As one example, in South Africa, DDT Jabavu, a noted Cape liberal, recommended educated fellow Africans read Booker T. Washington's biography of Douglass. He advertised the book, perhaps with some hyperbole, as alive and racy with a grandiose literary style. In 1896, a rival group of intellectuals led by former Liberian Alexander Crummell formed the American Negro Academy, an organization devoted to scholarly excellence. Freedwoman, feminist, and educator Anna Julia Cooper, who disliked the Academy's male exclusivity, claimed that Douglass steered clear of the blight-and-influence African nationalist intellectuals around Crummell. Nevertheless, the Academy had no qualms about appropriating Douglass after his death. Besides scholarly conferences and publication endeavors, the Academy organized public commemorations for abolitionists, Douglass included. Due to Crummell's old age, the key figure in the Academy was John Edward Bruce, a freedman, journalist, and one-time friend of Douglass. Bruce wrote poems, reminiscences, and lectures about Douglass found among his unpublished papers. He even designed a vase with Douglass's image on it, advertisements for which one can find as far away as Lagos, Nigeria. In his writings, Bruce made the incredible claim, despite an ambiguous documentary record, that as minister to Haiti, Douglass collaborated with the Haitians to thwart U.S. imperialist efforts to set up a naval base on Haitian territory. In reality, though trying to be respectful to Haitians, Douglass had tried to advance U.S. interests. Bruce, who later became editor for Marcus Garvey's Negro World, worked to make the Academy a truly Pan-African venture. by including as affiliates to the Academy the Caribbean scholar Theophilus Scholes, J.E. Casely Hayford of the Gold Coast, Edward Blyden or Shatuka Fatima of Sierra Leone, and the self-identified Egyptian journalist Dous Muhammad Ali. For Academy members, Douglass was a Pan-African diplomat, agitator, and orator, a man of letters with a rather large library, in sum, all the things that Booker T. Washington condescended towards. They openly loathed Washington's pretentious claim to be Douglass's heir. The spirit of Douglass was well represented at the groundbreaking Pan-African Conference of 1900. The meeting had precursors in the Black conventions organized by Black abolitionists, which Douglass himself attended and led. It had further precursors in the meetings of the Fanti Confederation, the International Conferences on Africa of 1893 and 1895, the former also being attended by Douglass. The 1900 conference can also be seen as a counterpoint to the 1884-85 meetings on Africa in Berlin, which led to partition of the continent. The Pan-African Conference was unique not only for its use of the newly minted word Pan-African, but also for its truly international character. It was organized by a West Indian, Henry Sylvester Williams, attended by Black peoples from Trinidad, Haiti, Britain, Liberia, South Africa, and the US, as well as by one Indian, Dadabai Nauroji, the outstanding theorist of colonial dream. Though merely advocating expanded rights within the colonial system and not decolonization, the conference provided a provisional starting point for the Pan-African movement, exemplified in the many Pan-African congresses to precede it. These congresses would culminate in the Fifth Pan-African Conference of 1945, which helped set the agenda for African decolonization. Though the proceedings of the conference were never published, and thus we know only little of what was actually discussed, the conference attendees did agree to publish an internationally circulated address to the nations of the world, composed largely by American Negro Academy member W.E.B. Du Bois. The address proclaimed, quote, "Let not the spirit of Garrison, Phillips, and Douglass wholly die out," end quote. The spirit of Douglass was thus present at the birth of Pan-Africanism as such. It should come as no surprise that the attendees agreed upon such an invocation of Douglass, for many were deeply influenced by him, either intellectually or personally. Anna Julia Cooper, an officer in the short-lived Pan-African Association that sprang from the conference, knew Douglass personally, though she also asserted that no Black man, Douglass included, could represent the whole race. Catherine Impey, an English reformer who wrote a short biography of Douglass in her journal, Anti-Caste, was a personal friend of Douglass and held long conversations with him on the greatness of ancient Ethiopian culture. Antenor Furman, one of Haiti's delegates, had been Haiti's foreign minister and worked with and sometimes against Douglass during his stint as U.S. minister to Haiti. His groundbreaking work of anti-colonial counter-anthropology, the essay on the equality of the human race, cites Douglass many times to prove the equality of human intellects. F.E.R. Johnson, Liberia's Attorney General and later Secretary of State, in a brief report to the Liberian press on the conference, claimed that Benito Sylvain's address had singled out Toussaint, Douglass, and King Menelik as great modern Africans. A Paris-educated Haitian, Sylvain came to the conference representing Ethiopia in his capacity as aide-de-camp to King Menelik, revered throughout the Black world for his recent military defeat of Italian imperialists. Before working in Ethiopia, Sylvain edited the Paris-based journal La Fraternité, which printed essays about Douglass, as well as French translations of Douglass's speeches on Haiti. As colonialism entrenched itself in Africa, fueling a scramble that led to World War I, and as British colonialism sidelined educated African reformers in favor of conservative indigenous rulers through the policy of indirect rule, appropriations of Douglass became ever more militant. Nothing did more to regenerate the legacy of Douglass than the mass movement led by Jamaican Marcus Garvey. Though Garveyism is still sometimes seen as the last outburst of 19th century immigrationism, Garvey and his followers incessantly saw themselves as the heirs to Douglass. By invoking Douglass to make demands for African unity and decolonization, Garveyism transformed Douglass into an anti-colonial icon. Recent scholarship is now showing that Garveyism had rather deep Caribbean and African roots. Adding to this work, I just want to suggest that Garveyism's unique reimaginings of Douglass also had African and Caribbean roots. Many of Douglass's ideas were anticipated in Trinidadian Frederick Durham's 1892 defense of Liberia and searing critique of Western imperialism, The Lone Star of Liberia, a book Garveyites knew of. Durham, a supporter of the 1900 Pan-African Conference, modeled his wide-ranging book on his acquaintance J.J. Thomas's polemic against Froude, but with a more radical tone. Durham denounced the overthrow of Reconstruction in the U.S. and the strangulation of Haiti. He fumed against Britain's imperial abolition from above, denounced Lincoln as a racist, and demanded reparations. A thoroughgoing emigrationist, Durham dreamily believed Liberia's destiny was to, quote, crush and expel all oppressors of the Africans in Africa, end quote. Of Douglass, Durham critically prophesied that in racist America, Douglass would never achieve his full potentials as a political figure. In Liberia, Durham continued, reinvoking the old immigrationist trope, he can be president. Even if Douglass did not go to Liberia to lead it in its purported anti-colonial destiny, Durham nevertheless maintained that, quote, we Africans, both full and mixed-blooded, are proud of Frederick Douglass and recognize in him the capable and distinguished generalissimo of all Africans living under European flags throughout the world. Douglass thus came to symbolize the struggles of all Africans under the flags of colonial oppressors. Journalists Robert Love and Deuce Muhammad Ali influenced Garvey more than any other intellectuals. While in Jamaica, Garvey apprenticed for Robert Love's paper, The Jamaica Advocate, an understudied journalistic adventure that printed articles on socialism, feminism, African affairs, the Haitian Revolution, and of course, Frederick Douglass. Love also collaborated with John Edward Bruce to produce a marvelous English translation of the Haitian Declaration of Independence. Garvey continued his political education in England, 1912 to 1914, working for the Egyptian journalist Deuce Muhammad Ali's African Times and Orient Review. The review was a truly Pan-African and Pan-Asian paper, critical of colonialism with contributors from Africa, Asia, Caribbean, the US, and England, with equally global circulation. Apart from articles about Douglass and Toussaint Louverture, the very first issue of the journal noted that its intended audience was, quote, the young and budding Sun Yat-sens, the Mustafa Kamils, the Blydens, the embryo Frederick Douglasses, end quote. In short, Douglass was placed alongside the preeminent nationalists of Africa and Asia, too. There were other militant invocations before Garveyism at this same moment. In a 1915 article in the Sierra Leone Weekly News, Orisatuka Fatima wrote, quote, a Blyden of Liberia, a Frederick Douglass of the United States, a Toussaint Louverture of Haiti are among the projectors and injectors of ideas who are followed up by large numbers of workers struggling to perfect their systems. Men may die, but ideas may not, end quote. This singling out of Blyden, Toussaint, and Douglass as a sort of holy trinity would become a common trope of Garveyism. Fatima was the son of liberated Yoruba slaves who repatriated from Guyana to Sierra Leone. Originally named William James Davies, he took up a Yoruba name under the influence of Blyden's Africanization movement. Fatima, an American Negro Academy member, had invoked Douglass to defend the Akeem Trading Company, a movement led by Gold Coast merchant Alfred Sam, who desired to build trade relations with African Americans and to encourage them to emigrate back to Africa. This was a movement Garvey would copy quite blatantly. In the same year, another Sierra Leonean, who smartly wrote under a pseudonym, complained in the pages of the Colonial and Provincial Reporter, quote, well might every African child feel on Empire Day, as Douglass felt on Independence Day, end quote. He urged fellow British colonial subjects not to celebrate Empire Day. In 1916, Atto Huma, who likely attended the 1900 Pan-African Conference, began serially publishing in the Gold Coast nation Douglass's 1890 speech to the Bethel Literary and Historical Association on the race problem. In the speech, Douglass used the term race problem to replace the more frequently used term Negro problem, a term that presumed Black people and not white racism were the problem. The editorial preface, presumably written by Ahuma himself, stated, quote, "The importance of this speech at a time of great awakening of race consciousness in West Africa cannot be overestimated," end quote. In 1911, Ahuma had published his seminal text, The Coast Nation and National Consciousness, and thus his rhetorical transition from national consciousness to race consciousness is a significant one. It came at a time when Blyden's ideas about a distinctive African personality had long taken hold among Christianized intellectuals in West Africa. It also came at a time when intellectuals were debating the prospects of the Akeem Trading Company, paying closer attention to African American political debates, and also calling for greater West African unity, which would later culminate in the National Congress of British West Africa, formed in 1920. Scholars usually associate the term race consciousness with African American intellectual discourses influenced by Garveyism and having nothing to do with the integrationist Frederick Douglass. Here we have an invocation from West Africa just prior to Garvey's meteoric rise, with Douglass at the heart of it. In the most militant case of all, John Chiwelembe inaugurated his 1915 revolt in Nyasaland, now Malawi, against colonial rule, with a stirring speech to his followers about John Brown. Chiwelembe had been educated to be a Christian missionary in the U.S. by African American ministers, steeped in the liberation theology of the abolitionist movement. Chiwelembe's biographer speculates that his most likely source of information on John Brown was the life and times of Frederick Douglass, Douglass's final autobiography. Chiwelembe's mentor, the radical white missionary Joseph Booth, whose book Africa for the African provided one of the blueprints for Chiwelembe's revolt, and incidentally a slogan for Garvey's movement, quoted Douglass many times. Booth used Douglass's biting rhetoric about the horrors of post-Reconstruction America to make a case for Afro-American expatriation to Africa, a misuse of Douglass's thinking, no doubt. Booth dreamed that immigrants to Africa would set up independent all-Black churches and institutions and eventually redeem the whole continent from colonial overlordship. The innumerable reimaginings of Douglass that occurred in Garvey's multi-million Universal Negro Improvement Association, I plan to recount separately elsewhere, but suffice it to briefly say here that these reimaginings ultimately had transatlantic origins. Even before leaving Jamaica for the U.S., in his talk with Afro-West Indians of 1916, Garvey invoked Douglass alongside Hannibal, Dessalines, Blyden, and the pharaohs of Egypt as one of the great African personalities. While in the U.S., Garvey paraphrased Douglass in his brilliant speeches, permitted his followers to hail him as Douglass's successor, and named the maiden ship of the transatlantic Black Star Line the SS Frederick Douglass. The official Catechism of the UNIA, written by West Indian George Alexander McGuire, required all members to know who Blyden, Douglass, and Louverture were, and to know that President Lincoln and Queen Victoria did not free the slaves. In the Holy Pibby of 1924, written by West Indian religious prophet and follower of Garvey, Robert Athelye Rogers, an angelic messenger from the Lord named Douglass descends and commands Rogers to deliver the new law to the children of Ethiopia and make Africa a power among nations. The Pibby would later influence Rastafarian theology. Rank-and-file Garveyites channeled such ideas in editorials to the Negro World, Garvey's mass-circulated newspaper. One critical contributor wrote, quote, "If Frederick Douglass in America had educated Africans towards Africa, there would have been a vast African empire, and neither England nor France nor Italy would have held Africa as they do today," end quote. The editorial harkens back to the old Pan-African myth that Douglass would have been much greater than he was had he migrated to West Africa. In another editorial, a Garveyite from Panama dreamed of a, quote, "new Frederick Douglass leading Negro troops across the battle plains of Africa," end quote. In short, In just a few decades since his passing, Douglass's spirit had marched on into the struggle against colonialism. And just to briefly conclude, Douglass had many lives, lives which he himself revised and reimagined according to the times in his 3 autobiographies and their multiple editions. He had many more lives in the hands of his interpreters. Yes, Douglass was not technically a founder of Pan-Africanism, nor could he ever have identified as a Pan-Africanist, but to ignore his image within this tradition means homogenizing, restricting, and sanitizing the possible ways Douglass could be interpreted or misinterpreted, while silencing many of his most creative and prolific disciples. As writer Peter Abrahams noted, Douglass could never be restricted to one time or place. A South African anti-colonial agitator, early friend of many of Africa's post-independent heads of states, and a key organizer of the Fifth Pan-African Conference of 1945, who later immigrated to Jamaica, Abrahams had written, quote, "Frederick Douglass was the historical, intellectual, and spiritual link bridging the 19th and 20th centuries in the struggles of all the dark folk of the earth." Thank you for listening.